So Nostradamus predicts the Third World War. What's so startling about that, you say? People have been predicting a Third World War ever since the second one finished. All right, but Nostradamus, who wrote this 400 years ago, also gives us the year and the signs to look for. He tells us who will be fighting and why, and suggests there will be occurrences of unprecedented natural disasters such as floods, famine, and earthquakes, and tells us exactly when and where these events will take place. He assembles a powerful jigsaw puzzle, the eventual pattern of which cannot be denied. So let's take the pieces of that puzzle one by one. I might warn you that from now on the subject matter will not be very comfortable, but as the thinking creations of this universe, perhaps we have an obligation to protect it and consider any warnings to that end. Remember, these warnings are not the opinions of the producers of this program, but interpretations of Nostradamus based on facts available today. If we are to have a war, we must ask ourselves 5 questions. When? Where? Who will be fighting? How long will it last? And who will survive? First we ask when, and although there are several hints left by Nostradamus, there are 2 which are quite clear and must be considered side by side. One, it could be as early as 1981, and the other stating quite clearly that the war will be well underway by 1999.
In the year 1999 and 7 months, from the sky will come the great king of terror. He will bring back to life the great king of the Mongols. Before and after, war reigns happily.
Our second quatrain is unanimously understood as an Arab invasion of Europe, and the date, although obscure, can be determined by means of astrology.
The king enters Europe wearing a blue turban. He will reign for less than a revolution of Saturn. The king with a white turban, his heart banished to Byzantium, Sun, Mars, and Mercury near Aquarius.
These regular conjunctions can be predicted, and they do occur very regularly, but they don't occur frequently. The Sun, Mars, Mercury, and Aquarius will be together in 1981 in February. Actually, on the 4th of February, the moon will be passing in front of the sun. We'll get an eclipse of the sun.
So we have a time. It could be as early as 1981, and in the specific words of Nostradamus, it's already underway by 1999. That one quatrain suggests that it will be less than 29 years in duration, and also gives a hint of who will be fighting. To have a war, you must have aggression. Where will it come from? Russia? China? The West? In quatrain after quatrain, Nostradamus indicates that the trouble will come from the Middle East, specifically Iran, or, as it was called in his day, Persia.
By fire and sword, not far from the Black Sea, they shall come from Persia to seize upon Trebizond. The kingdoms of the church will be overcome by the sea. Towards Persia, very near 1 million. Help provided too late, Persia will turn and invade Macedonia. France by neglect shall be assaulted by 5 sides. Tunis and Algiers shall be stirred by the Persians.
There are too many references to ignore the suggestion that the Middle East will play a central role in the trouble to come. And yet, is this a realistic possibility? After all, Nostradamus was talking about a time which may be only 2 years away. Could Persia, or Iran as we know it, cause a third world war? To answer this, let's turn to what we know of Iran today and the revival of Islam throughout the world.
Founded in the 7th century, the Islam faith is the world's youngest universal religion. With an estimated 750 million followers, the faith has become the second largest and is fast catching up to Christianity. This past decade has seen a sudden and somewhat unexpected resurgence of Islam. Muslims throughout the world are rediscovering their spiritual roots and reasserting the political power of the Islamic way of life. The Islamic moral code is regarded by many Westerners as a relic of the Stone Age, with harsh criminal provisions. For example, an habitual thief is punished by having his hand cut off. A person caught drinking alcohol receives 80 lashes. An adulterer is either scourged or stoned to death. World attention is now focused on the Islamic countries. They form what's been dubbed a crescent of crisis. Now that crescent straddles the crossroads of 3 continents, stretching in an arc from southern Africa through the Middle East to Southeast Asia. More than 20 countries in this region are exclusively Islamic. Muslims make up between 50 and 90% of the populations of another 8 countries, and in varying degrees up to 50% in yet a further 35 countries. Interestingly, the Soviet Union, with 50 million Muslims, has the world's 5th largest Islamic population after India, Indonesia, Pakistan and Bangladesh. Communist China also has a large Muslim community in its southern region, estimated at just under 18 million people. The crescent of crisis, as the name implies, contains most of the world's trouble spots. It also contains most of the world's known oil deposits, a vital factor with the energy problems now being felt by most industrialized nations, both communist and non-communist. It's the importance of this factor that's given added impetus to the Islamic revival. The realization by Muslims that the major powers have become increasingly dependent on them for their very existence. The world's Muslims believe that they and their countries have been both economically and culturally suppressed by the superpowers, but that now, because of the world oil situation, they're finally able to reassert themselves. The question that still remains is how the superpowers will react to this continuing development of the Islamic faith.
Out of the country of Greater Arabia shall be born a strong master of Mohammedan law, who shall vex Spain and conquer Granada, and by sea shall come to the Italian nation.
So now we must consider that Islam, or the Muslim nations, could pose a major threat politically and economically to world peace. They have the objective, they have the numbers. But do they have the technology to wage a nuclear war?
We're fairly confident that none of the Muslim countries as yet possess any nuclear weapons.
Dr. Donald Brennan, director of the Hudson Institute in New York, is advisor to the American government on international power play and nuclear armaments.
The major threat that we're concerned with in security planning for the United States is and will remain for a long while to come the Soviet Union. The Soviets could undoubtedly inflame crises in many areas of the world that might lead to major wars. There are no other powers that are in prospect that would pose the kind of risk to Western security that the Soviet Union does. The Chinese were perceived to be more of a threat several years ago, but even when they were thought to be some kind of threat, no one thought of them as the primary threat, and it was not believed that they would be the primary threat for generations, probably. The possible threat from countries in the Middle East, whether Iran or the Arabic countries, is primarily an economic one in the near term, in that these countries control much of the world's supply of oil, and that can become an important security threat. Apart from that problem, because in part of the importance of oil, the Soviet Union is very active in becoming involved in the Middle East, and the Soviets might very well participate in some Middle Eastern crisis in some way that might very realistically lead to a war.
A combination of Islamic manpower with Russia's nuclear capacity. It could prove disastrous to the West, and as Dr. Brennan suggested, such a combination is quite possible. We know the Soviet Union has the 5th largest Muslim population in the world, yet another reason why the two countries could combine. Also, surprisingly, Nostradamus even indicates that there might be a change in southern Russia, involving a split and even a decline of communism.
the Moorish law will be seen to fail, followed by another that is more pleasing. Boris Danes will be the first to give way through gifts and tongues to another more appealing.
This reference to Moorish law is intriguing because some 10 years before Nostradamus first began his writings, Sir Thomas More published his famous Utopia, the great formula for the perfect but imaginary state. Obviously, Nostradamus would be familiar with the work, but what is intriguing is that he should predict that the Utopia, More's law, would become the basis for a new and revolutionary system of government in the 20th century, communism. And further than that, to suggest that it will ultimately weaken and fail.